Hello, I'm Ben. Welcome to the channel. So today we're going to talk about personality. In previous videos, we've talked about psychology and traits that drive people, and we talked about intelligence and the different types of intelligence and what actually can basically translate into success versus non-success. IQ doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be successful. As a matter of fact, recent tests over the last 50 years suggest otherwise. There's certain success traits from IQ, just like there's certain personality traits that suggest success. So when you talk about personality, I think that's much more relevant to success. And I think it's things that people don't focus on. They kind of say, I am who I am, versus looking at these traits and trying to cultivate a personality that's useful to them and to their futures. So there's a test done a few years back, which basically 18,000 personality traits were suggested and included in this test. And basically they took 200 people, they took a cluster, 200 clusters of people, groups of words out of these 18,000 objectives to see what people would choose and what they would circle around as people describing themselves. And what came from this, the gentleman's name that did this test, his name was Allport. And what Allport found was apparently there's a central thought around personality. So this gentleman, Gordon Allport, he spent his entire career working on these traits to better describe, for testing purposes and relevant survey purposes, on how people would be or what they would deem valuable, what people saw as a personality trait that would be valuable. So think about a big trait, and it breaks down into different quadrants, right? So you have a cardinal trait. That's the biggest building block of your personality. You can't really change that. That's something that's inborn, and you've basically been adding to that your entire life. And the success that you've had has helped you build to that, right? So that cardinal trait is now going to be built out of those building blocks. And those building blocks you have the experience from, and you have the reactions from your childhood and everything else. Those are called central traits, okay? So those are the biggest building blocks of your personality that right now you have no control over it, because you started educating yourself in this way when you were a child, and what worked for you based on positive response or negative response, that's what you remembered. That's what your brain grabbed hold to. It started these building blocks, and then you started building your cardinal traits out of these central traits. What you can impact, though, are called secondary traits, and that's things that you self-educate on, or you learn later in life, or you determine that are important through responses and through experience later in life. So they're not as impactful or not as fixed as your central traits are, and definitely are not as fixed as your cardinal traits are, but that is how a personality is built, okay? So your personality is built out of the cardinal traits, the central traits, and the secondary traits. These are the building blocks of your personality. And what was done through Gordon Allport's test, he was trying to see how people determined 18,000 different traits, what they thought were relevant versus not. And the test was incredible. It took the 18,000 and knocked it all the way down to the big five, okay? People use 5 traits to describe themselves specifically, and they do this more than anything else. Think about that. Went from 18,000 to subordinates of basically 5 cardinal traits. And those cardinal traits are openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, or extraversionism, I say extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or neuroticism. I always say that wrong, okay? Neuroses. So I'll go through each one of those and tell you what those are, but these big 5 dimensions of human personality are the 5 categories in which Allport organized all other behavioral traits into. So 18,000 have been shrunk down into these 5. And when you're assessing people, a lot of self-assessments as well, when you're putting in your traits of how you respond to things, this is what that comes from. Okay, so this is something that actually has a lot to do with self-assessments that we do for jobs and schools and IQ testing. All those things use derivatives of this big 5. So openness, let's look at that. Openness is talking about openness to experiences. At one end, you would be individuals who are creative, intellectual, and open-minded. These people are expanding and learning through these experiences. Versus the opposite end are people who are shallow, simple, and less intelligent. So it's talking about intelligence here is the capacity, that creative intelligence that we mentioned in a previous video. People may not have that creative intelligence. So it suggests a lower IQ here based on this trait. So that's openness. They're open to experiences. The next is conscientiousness. Here it would be organized from organization, responsibility, and cautious people versus those who are irresponsible, careless, and frivolous. So you can see that's two completely different mental breakdowns when you talk about conscientiousness. You have those people who are dress right dress, who are typically good business people, who are typically good leaders, who are typically good folks that get out ahead and are organized, responsible, and cautious, and they take risk in a cautious, dedicated manner. And the flip side of that is those that are irresponsible, careless, and frivolous. So if you find yourself in one of those columns, if you lean more towards careless and frivolous, you most likely are going to be limited in life to what kind of roles you can have because of the responsibilities those roles serve to other people. So that's just something to know that's important about where you fall in that conscientiousness spectrum. The next is extraversion. So you have people who are assertive, outgoing, and energetic versus those that are quiet, reserved, and shy. And as you see here, one's not bad over the other. What it suggests, though, is what you'll be successful at based on those building blocks. And remember what I said earlier in the video. You cannot change cardinal traits. That's what you are. That's who you are. You start building that from day one when you're a child. You can have impact on central traits because those are learned decade over decade, and you can put new central traits in. And like, for example, when you decide you're going to be a leader, I did that about 12, 13 years old. When you decide that just because you constantly are put in that role, then you can improve as a student and you can learn all you can about how to be a leader. That pretty much solidifies that as a cardinal trait, even though it was a central trait that came later. So then the last thing that you can have the most impact on are those secondary traits. So if you find yourself as an invert, somebody that's quiet and reserved and shy, you can start working on some secondary traits that you allow yourself to expand and stretch yourself a bit to see if you can't have some impact on a central trait. So you always can grow and evolve and change, but one is not bad over the other, just so you know. So that's the third extraversion. The fourth is agreeableness. Here are individuals who are sympathetic, kind, and affectionate versus those who are cold, argumentative, and cruel. Now, the agreeableness trait is interesting enough used in criminal trials and in solidification of how criminals will be handled when you're talking about parole, sentencing, stuff like that. Is the person overtly agreeable or are they overtly argumentative? If that's the case, it impacts their personality. And even though you can do things around the secondary traits, some of those things are set and it is what it is. That's why some people are career criminals. It may not have anything to do with where they came from an economic standpoint or from a race or cultural standpoint. It may just be that personal character developed these secondary traits where these items were more beneficial or more sought out. And ultimately, once you do that, so if you think about gang bangers and people that are in gangs, they're taught that being argumentative and being aggressive and doing those things, they're taught that at a young age where it's somewhat influential. If you think they're 10 to 12 or 14 years old and they're learning that being aggressive is how you move up in the organization, and this is the only people that treat you like a family, ultimately, those things are going to become secondary traits. And as they cultivate those traits and as they learn and get reward from those traits, guess what? They now become central traits. They're a bigger portion of that cardinal trait of who that person is. So some of those things cannot be turned around. Some of those things, it is a life sentence because you focused on that and used that as your building blocks. So that is number 4, agreeableness. And you can see how these traits have deep impacts on who we are and can say a lot about what motivates us. The last is neuroticism. Here we contrast anxious, unstable, and moody personalities with those that are emotionally stable, calm, and content. And you can see how here, if you are anxious and unstable and you allow that to sustain and you don't do things that can change that, you see that those secondary traits that are accommodating to that can be damaging as they move forward to permanent building blocks into that central trait region. So that's something to think about when you're trying to impact or improve your content or how you do things. It is imperative that you do that, because growth, if you don't correct the bad behavior, the good behavior can't get in, is basically how it works. And the bad behavior will become concrete and it'll be all you're dealing with. So extraversion measures traits including activity level, sociability, expressiveness, assertiveness, ambition, dogmatism, and aggressiveness. That's what extraversion measures. Neuroticism measures traits like inferiority, unhappiness, anxiety, dependence, hypochondria, guilt, and obsessiveness. There's a lot of guilt in the world and a lot of hypochondria. That comes from this neuroticism that we're talking about. And psychoticism measures traits like risk-taking, impulsivity, irresponsibility, manipulativeness, sensation-seeking, tough-mindedness, and practicality. So this is an alternative to what we just mentioned. This is called the Eysenck alternative, and it looks at those three as the primary central traits that drive people's responses. So that's extraversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. I think that comes from more of a psychological background than a mentality thought process. So that person was a professor of psychology at the University of London. So I do think that they're talking more from a medicated or medicinal purpose type thought process in those for extraversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. So you'll hear those two thought processes pushed back and forth is how you look at this. But remember the big five: openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, because those things do impact what we say and do. They do impact the dimensions of our human personality, and it is something that came from a very large suggestion of 18,000 options down to that big five. So look into that more if you find that interesting. The gentleman that did this study and that released that, his name is Gordon Allport, and that's Allport. If you like subjects like this and things of this nature, please like and subscribe, and please share if you think someone would find this of interest. And that was a little bit of psychobabble about personality traits. I'm Ben. Be good.